It feels like everyone's asking the same question these days. What is going on with this housing market?
Yeah.
And we're tackling that very question today in this deep dive with, just the right person, I think, to help us kind of crack the code here.
Oh, good.
You analyze thousands of buyer and seller interactions every year, so you're giving us that boots on the ground perspective that I think is so valuable.
Absolutely.
And one thing that really stood out to me in your notes was this idea of buyer psychology being especially cautious this year, which makes sense on the surface, but I'm curious to dig into what's really driving that feeling from your perspective.
Well, you would think that cautious just means that they're being careful. But what we're finding is that it's really this kind of sticker shock that people are going through where they're pre-approved at a certain amount and they go out and the payment is significantly more than what they were really thinking about.
It's like looking at that final price tag after taxes and shipping are added and you're like, oh,
exactly.
It's not quite as appealing as it was in my cart.
Yeah, it's a payment shock. And so they're either having to really kind of reduce what they're looking for, or they're just like, I'm going to wait it out.
Right. And so then on top of that, you mentioned this lack of quality options further fueling the caution.
Yes.
So it's like the double whammy there.
The perfect house is what they want, and they're going to wait for it.
It's that fear of missing out. What if we jump in now and then something better comes on the market?
Right.
But then on the flip side, how are sellers reacting to this whole environment? Because it's got to be impacting them too.
Yeah, it's interesting because while buyers are hitting the pause button, sellers are kind of this weird holding pattern too.
Yeah.
Because they're like, well, if I sell, where do I go?
Right. They don't see that next step for them.
Yeah. And so they're staying put, which then, limits the inventory even more.
It's like a giant game of musical chairs, but no one wants to give up their seat.
Right.
Because they aren't sure if they'll find a better one.
Exactly. And so it's, and what we're finding is, on the seller side, if you've got a hot property, like it's in a great location or it's got, something really special about it, those sellers are still getting, top dollar.
Okay.
But that's not the case across the board.
Right. Are those the exceptions to the rule?
Yes, exactly. And so if you don't have, the nicest place and it's not in the best location, then we're definitely seeing a softening. And they're having to reduce their expectations.
So it's kind of like a tale of two markets then.
Yeah, you can say that.
And you mentioned, we were talking about the luxury market earlier.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing some of that play out.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the higher end is very, very strong.
Even though the rest of it is kind of interesting.
Which is not what you would think.
So some people are stepping back, but other people are like, I'm going all in on my dream house.
Right.
And then what about condos? Because we've seen so much new construction, but it feels like the resale market might be a different story.
Yeah, we are seeing people really gravitate towards those new buildings that have all the bells and whistles.
Yeah, makes sense.
But then the older buildings that don't have all the, the new stuff.
Right.
Those are sitting on the market longer.
So if you are interested in a condo, that might be where there's some opportunity.
Potentially, yeah. But you just have to be very, very careful.
Right, because a bargain isn't a bargain if it comes with all these hidden costs.
Exactly. And the thing about it is there's a lot of talk about interest rates maybe coming down.
Oh, really?
And if that happens, I think we're going to see a whole...
a flood of activity.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see.
Wow.
Because then that's going to unleash all those people that were waiting.
Right.
And then sellers will be like, oh, gosh, I got to get in now.
Before the market's flooded.
Exactly. So it's a very interesting time.
So timing is everything in this market. But, assuming all that's true, what advice would you give to our listener who's thinking, I want to make a move. I want to invest. What should they be looking out for? Where are the potential pitfalls?
Yeah, it's like you got to ride the wave at the right time,
Yeah.
So being prepared and knowing what you want.
Right.
Because if you're not ready when the wave comes, you're going to miss it.
Totally. So it's having your finances in order, but also really being clear on what matters most to you in a property.
Exactly. Don't get distracted by the shiny objects, especially in this market. So yeah, have your must-haves, your nice-to-haves, and, don't fall in love with something before
it's yours. Yeah. And you mentioned, new condo developments. Obviously, those are popping up everywhere. Should people be approaching those with caution?
I would say with more caution than maybe a year ago.
Oh, really?
Because we are seeing some developers over-promising and under-delivering.
Yeah.
Projects are getting delayed, they're going over budget, and Yeah, that's not what you want.
Right. So it's not just the location and the fancy amenities. It's like really vetting the developer themselves.
Absolutely. Look at their track record.
Yeah.
Talk to people who've bought from them before.
Yeah.
And ask the hard questions.
Yeah. Trust but verify, especially with a big purchase like that.
For sure.
Okay. Good advice. So it sounds like, there's opportunity in this market, but it's really about being strategic. And I think some people might be scared off thinking, now's not a good time to buy, but you're saying that's not necessarily true.
I think it depends on your circumstances and, your risk tolerance, but there's definitely opportunity there.
Right, because there's less competition, potentially more room for negotiation.
Absolutely. We're seeing sellers be more realistic with pricing. They might be more willing to contribute to closing costs, things like that.
So this pause, this kind of like moment in time, could actually be really advantageous for the right buyer.
It's all about perspective, right?
Well said. Well, thank you so much for kind of walking us through this. I think it's a lot to digest, but the main takeaway for me is, the market's always going to ebb and flow.
Yeah.
The key is just learning how to kind of flow with it and be prepared for whatever comes next.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us, and for our listeners out there, until next time on the Deep Dive, happy house hunting.